The critic Clement Greenberg advocated for limits in art. It's funny because we think of art as being totally free. In art, you can do whatever you want. That's why it's better than life. As for me, I don't want limits in my paintings. I want to be free. I don't consider myself as having a fixed system or methodology for painting. Same for content. I rarely seem to have a finished subject, idea, or mental picture in mind before making a mark. For me, how the painting is made becomes what the painting eventually is about. In this way, my work de-emphasizes intellect, or the head, in favor of other source entities, mysterious and indescribable, but often referred to with words such as heart, soul, even body. Body language. It's hard to describe, but here's what happens. Sometimes I see lines that branch like a Y or a lambda overlaid on the form of the air. These lines pull on space. My body is always in tension, relating itself to these letters or lines or branches, which I should say also appear as ruts or holes in the surface of space. So, in essence, the space is divided by floating tree branches. They are floating, rotating, all dancing with one another. Here's the challenge. You have to hold them, but also know how to let them spin, or go about their intended movement without your intervention. All of this visual spinning can be disorienting, but you can't let yourself fall over or trip on your feet. You have to exert a certain amount of control over yourself and these emerging edges. It helps to make yourself stand up straight. Down through the ages, humans have developed many ways of understanding the body, but the total adherence to any one of these methods to the detriment of others limits our understanding of the whole reality. A grasp of the Hindu meditation focal points known as chakras can be helpful. Such Indian traditions hold that human life simultaneously exists in two parallel dimensions, one physical body, and another psychological, emotional, mind, non-physical, called the subtle body. They say the chakra of the neck becomes blocked when we cannot speak our truths, and standing up straight can help open it up. If you sing in a choir, they will tell you the same thing. If you want to open up your throat to sing, stand up straight. Certain voices are loud when they implore you to stand up straight. And of course, bad posture is an affliction with damaging physical consequences. But the mantra stand up straight, as a moral imperative, suffers from not knowing enough. What you will learn from a good choral instructor is not only to keep your head from tilting up when you sing, but also to tighten your ass. Robert Beverly Hale, instructor of anatomical and proportional drawing at the Art Students League in the 60s, concurred. To stand up straight, he said, collect the fibers of gluteus maximus. But of course, the aim of life is not always to be a tight ass. Sometimes things have to be looser. You have to check in with your asshole. And if you have back or neck problems, stand up straight. I'm not a doctor, but I do know that Shakespeare's English was written with a hunch that could tune in to the rhythm and cadence, the swelling and beating of your heart. And this is why we hunch. To protect our hearts by the concavity of our backs from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and to nurse its woundedness sometimes, and also to channel it, to get in touch with it and the physicality of our bodies which it can possess. The horror of mimesis. In his essay, The Horror of Mimesis, David Young Kim explores the trend that began in the Renaissance of dissecting corpses in order not only to further an anatomical understanding of the human body, but also to conceive of a realistic, representational, or mimetic style of painting. Kim discusses The Head of Medusa by an unknown Flemish artist, which shows the severed head of the mythological woman. The work reflects both the thorough knowledge of human anatomy and also the horror of the dissection which made this knowledge possible. Later, around 1617, Rubens, possibly after viewing Caravaggio's rendering, itself perhaps inspired by a lost Da Vinci, took up the Medusa subject as well. Ever since, art historians have interpreted such a severing of head and body in oppositional terms, i.e., intellect versus soul, brain versus heart, etc. Perseus, Medusa's killer, was viewed by some as a triumphant intellect that vanquished base, low, carnal desires embodied in the woman's tangled serpent hair. What is often left out of these interpretations is that Medusa herself gave her hair its stone-killing properties after having been raped by the god Neptune. In her rage, the beautiful daughter of Phorcys turned her most alluring asset into a means of destroying those that would admire her for it. In this way, men would suffer as she had for their own base, carnal motivations. If she had been figuratively turned to stone by her sexual ordeal, then they would be literally stoned. But I digress, intellectually. Dissection. Kant thought what we knew was given a priori, which means before, but he also thought we learned things a posteriori, which means after. His noble science would agree. Both are true. We take after when it's tested by a scientific method, and all we know before is owed to a pre-planned genetic code. In the 18th century, Hume wrote treatises which turned a skeptic eye on any kind of knowing a priori. His ideas became the groundwork for science and secularism, or the pursuit of learning through observing nature. At the time, they had developed new ways of studying nature too. As a painter, I'm drawn to the subject of dissection, and what we today call the dichotomies of the mind and the body. By removing one from the other, the head of Medusa displays the most literal separation, and it therefore is the easiest to understand. Many works that speak to me touch on this same subject, and in so doing broaden the effect until I begin to see head-heart dichotomies in just about all art. In my view, however, one, heart, precedes the other, head. One is a priori, the other a posteriori. One involves making, the other interpreting. Further, my purpose is not to reject this great dissection outright, but to call attention to the head-over-heart approach as it exists in the current art landscape, and to suggest that it in the end extols art that exists in a world separate from other human beings and separate from the body that makes up all of us and that we all share here on earth. The Anatomy Lesson. In W.G. Sebald's book, The Rings of Saturn, an unnamed narrator describes Rembrandt van Rijn's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaus Tulp. The narrator points out that the group of men are looking not at the body of the corpse that the physician has dissected, but at the medical textbook in the lower right corner of the painting. In this way, the body has vanished completely under the dissection, and the words that accompany them. William Heckscher, in his examination of Rembrandt's anatomy lesson, distinguishes between two kinds of light that exist within the painting. First is the hidden words of the book, which elucidate or explain the dissection to the medical onlookers. The other is the light coming off the corpse, which illuminates the trauma of the dissected body. The question becomes, could there be elucidation and illumination in a way that does not vanish the body? Can light coexist with form? I think so. Lots of both in equal measure. A short history. Beginning in the 1940s, the art of the avant-garde in America began approaching pure abstraction. In his essay, Towards a Newer Laocoon, Clement Greenberg, the critic spokesperson for the group of artists that would become known as the Abstract Expressionists, saw the development towards total non-objective art as painting's declaration that its deepest concern spoke to form. Form was geometric, hard-edged, but also soft and sensuous. The divide between the two opposing camps was real. Newman painted painfully straight lines, while de Kooning gave in to his basest carnal desires without a worry. Was there a division here between the head and the body? Not quite an anatomical rendering anymore, but still a kind of severing of the body from the head. A dissection, in the strictest sense of the word, means two-part division. Although abstract expressionism had replaced the representational styles of European painting, the old tendencies to sever remained. In order to stomach the horror of the autopsy, one effectively had to remove all sensation and become an isolated brain with a mechanical eye and hand, effectively a bodiless head. The Europeans used their severed head, akin to the one end, the head of Medusa, as a powerful tool of clinical examination. And beginning in the 1500s, Europeans began dissecting other bodies, not just dead ones, through imperialism and colonization. And the same was true for the abstract expressionists. By and large, they separated the abstract from the expressive, largely in an effort to reflect the continued importance and power of America as an imperialist force capable of exerting its ability to clinically incise where it wanted to in the world. Read the body. Some artists, like Rothko or Pollock, went a little further. Their use of shape and line, respectively combined with a shared gestural method, attempted to free themselves of subjecthood altogether. In Beware the Tragic Sublime, Gwenaël Kerledu describes how Rothko confronted the tragic question of sublimating the self, and eventually his paintings became the figure by itself, each painting a body pressed not only up against the picture plane, but also all the way out to the far edges and to the corners. With every inch of the canvas body, there was no air, no space for the viewer to escape, and so the paintings possessed their audience by their pure tragedy. Pollock went where even Rothko dared not to go, all the way into pure non-subjectivity. He lost himself in a world where he was not himself and could take no one with him. His marks never flowed past the edge of the canvas. He wouldn't let anyone in. Although he tried to be free of the outside world, the consequences for not being responsible in his life still found their way in. That is, when he smashed bottles on his canvas and then walked over the surface, barefoot, he still wound up with glass in his feet. Greenberg's ultimate goal was to establish limitations between medium specificity, which is a technical term for a notion that art is defined by its medium. In Greenberg's world, painting was tied to a certain tradition, or certain stories which we tell ourselves about painting. It uses paint, usually oil, on a rectangular canvas with some kind of support which can hang on a wall. Greenberg thought abstract expressionism's value came from its historical precedent. In the post-World War II decade, the American avant-garde felt itself responsible for the whole history of European painting. But now it was free of its subject, the metaphorical part which related it back to the pre-war, Eurocentric world we knew. It was no longer about representation, although there was still a separation, a dissection. The great thing about abstract expressionism was how far it took art in either direction. We learned a lot. Did the abstract expressionists need to martyr themselves for this newfound awareness? No one asked them to do it. They wanted to, and they taught us something new, something about the body. We had already learned a great deal about the mental games of abstraction from the early proponents of synthetic cubism, but where we hadn't landed was that touch could exist as a means of exploration as well. To Pollock and Rothko, touch meant being attentive to the physical sensations that the medium itself allowed. They felt things in their bodies, although their bodies were separate or longed to be separate from the external world. Greenberg advocated for a new conception of limits in medium specificity, so that painting could remain separate. But Greenberg's call for limitations was a death knell for specificity. The developments in painting that Pollock and company shared with the world could not be held back by boundaries between mediums. The body could express itself in new ways, revolting against dissection and celebrating the joy of touch. But with dissection, did they also subvert the head altogether? Did the body art of the 1960s sap the power of the head, only to discard it, choosing instead to live life in Sleepy Hollow? Not so sleepy. Looks like a party to me. I'm game. Personally, body art always makes me more aware of my gaze. The male gaze specifically. Like, looks like a party to me, and I'm game. But the beauty or message of body art comes as a direct reaction to the action painters of the previous decades, in that it forefronts subjectivity rather than diminishing or trying to be free of it. Subjectivity, your subjectivity, my subjectivity, became about creating an awareness of my gaze looking at your exposed body, and maybe you at mine. I cannot dissect the body of Carolee Schneemann in Fresh Blood, A Dream Morphology. If I want to look at her in a way that denies my subjectivity, and therefore hers, I would have to think about another way for my eye to interact with her body, a way that does not reduce the figure to lifeless abstraction, or selfish emotional expression. I don't think body art was all about the body. It was about the eye too, the looking at the body which sends the viewer on a mental trip through the politics of his eye. If there is a separation at all, it's that there is a lot of work to do in confronting, perhaps diverting, perhaps transforming the gaze altogether. But the message is optimistic. If we work at it, maybe we can learn how body art can coexist with the gaze, and come to some synthesis between seemingly disparate subjective personas, and in this way emerge in a new kind of liberation within subjectivity. Is that a paradox? In the late 1960s, art existed in a culture of optimism, perhaps in part due to the promise of a new gaze, a new way of looking and making paintings. The 1970s arrived with the surge in experimental deconstructing and rethinking of painting. Artists began considering the structures behind the painting, that is, the support which held the canvas together and allowed it to hang on a wall. Behind the experimentation was a sense of doubt in the ability for a painting to support itself amid the structures of the broader cultural landscape. The painting desperately wanted to exist outside of the economic structures which tethered painting to the past. The doubt in the security of artists living in a social situation which might not have a place for them eventually extended to the idealistic vision of the movement itself. Artists in the seminal exhibition High Times and Hard Times, New York Painting 1967 to 1975, took their paintings apart and put them back together. But by the late 1970s, many painters had returned to the easel. But, as a mechanic might tell you, if you take apart the machine and put it back together, you might learn something about how it works. I believe there are ways of making paintings which can borrow ideas from the experimental body art of the 1970s, but exist in or provide for a shared world of painting. Of course, the economic structures within which we exist are flawed and need changing, but perhaps there are ways to create paintings which could support a more responsible gaze, while at the same time loving and providing that sense of touch, that connection. We want to share moments with people who like to look at our paintings. We want to bring people together in a way that provides for subjectivity, but also its opposite, not being bound to ourselves. Sometimes people are too wrapped up in their own worlds, and who can blame them? Ideally, money is the agent which binds us morally to each other. I am responsible to you, you are responsible to me. And with this premise, human beings have built economic systems which ideally are capable of supporting people. Jobs, selling our labor. We start to question a system we have created when it no longer can support people. The idea in the 1970s, High Times and Hard Times, was that the old means of support in a painting, the stretcher bars, had to change in order to provide for a vision of freedom, of free love, of being able to look at the same time, not abstractly, not possessively, and not conservatively, but responsibly, at Carolee Schneeman's body. The economic system we live with, money, is not only a gauge of morality, but crucially of religion. We have faith in a system that provides for us, but religion is not only about getting, it's also about giving. We have a certain debt to other people. Personally, I believe it's no small coincidence that we spell doubt and debt so similarly. I think there's a strong association between these words in our minds. America has so much debt. How could it ever reasonably be paid? With what economy? Today we don't believe in debt. We can't because the economic system that supports us could never pay it back. We don't believe in the debt that we have to other people anymore, as represented by the economy. In a symbolic way, not in a real way, that was the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted to go home, work from home, because we couldn't stand being in the institutional sites which constantly reminded us of the impossible debt that we owe. It's a connection that I have been drawing through COVID-19. We've all been making connections as we're coming to terms with how soulless work is with massive piling debt and a system that does not even provide for its people. I'm not saying that America is ever going to pay off its debt. I don't think it will. But the solution, as we tentatively begin sticking our toes into the water of normal life again, and our economy starts up again, is not shying away from this debt, not challenging it with conspiratorial claims about the standard which supports the system, where'd all the gold go? Rather, taking on the mantle of debt, of work which you owe to the world, work you know you owe to the world because it would make it a better place, but not in a dissecting way, in a responsible way. This is the decision to transform pain into something else, into joy, no, rather fiery burning love. Doubt it. You can't fault someone for trying to escape a world they didn't ask to enter and in which they have to sell their labor at McDonald's to survive. Dismantling our economic system would mean going deeper into our psyche. Money has a deep history, old stories which have currency, still today. Is the point to learn about these stories and question them in order to see what we could change? I'm wary of dissection, but if it means the freedom from having to work a job, no, that's selfish, but I can't help wondering if there's something in even just looking at the stories we tell ourselves, specifically about faith, or economically speaking, our investment in other people. Would it be too much, too painful to dissect these stories? Stories are made up of language. Perhaps a certain amount of words are necessary around a painting, or in a painting. And we think of language emerging from the thoughts in our head, but what happens when the body expresses itself in thought, or the mind in feeling? Europe. Europeans had an idea of beauty, or joy, or paradise, which caused them to justify their violence. To them, the pursuit of knowledge and the beautification of their clothes and cities was worth the horrors which they unleashed on the world. Their painting is beautiful, but was it worth it? Do we think of representational painting as progress? And if so, is that progress worth violence? Are there other ways to progress? As it stands, we find ways of tolerating a world that has its share of beauty, its share of joy, and its share of cruelty. Do we want to take a chance on change? Are we worried that the result of change would be more suffering? We need to find a solution for living together, that's for sure, but also living in our imaginations. And we need some kind of measure for violence, pain, suffering, some way of gauging when it gets to be too much. And of course, our ideas about punishment aren't working. I hope that I can say that I want above all else for there not to be violence, pain, or suffering employed in response to pain. Can I say that? It's not an easy point to make. I think justice's truth can get called into question when it employs too much pain in retribution. William Blake wrote about a character from his visions called Urizen, who enslaved himself to the idea of enslaving people. He had a book of brass in which he wrote, quote, laws of peace, of love, of unity, of pity, compassion, forgiveness. Let each choose one habitation, his ancient infinite mansion. One command, one joy, one desire, one curse, one weight, one measure, one king, one God, one law. It didn't sound too bad until he got to the curse part. One of Urizen's main tenets was to eliminate pain and suffering throughout the world. As for the idea of being enslaved and enslaving others, well, that's how our economy works, right? That's how money works. You work for other people and get paid some of the currency that comes from someone else's labor. You are bound to other people, and to a certain extent, other people are bound to you for survival. We stop having faith in this system when it stops doing its job eliminating our pain, when we have to work too long, or again can't provide for ourselves. No man is an island, but a part of me wants to protest this with all my heart. I am an artist. My labor may not always be commodifiable. People may not want to buy my paintings. If I'm being totally honest and totally selfish, I'd rather not have to work at all, or work on my paintings with less urgency, slower so I can begin to lose track of time. At the heart of the problem, there's the question of having a debt to other people for providing you with money to survive and make art. Nothing is free. But come on, this is America, land of the free. Where's my UBI? Freedom is important to me. I like things that are free. I make paintings on pieces of plywood I find in the dumpster. There is no transaction in this situation. The plywood isn't even a gift. No one intended to give it to me. They simply threw it away, and I found it. There's no debt, no money involved. The only way you can think of things you find as free is if you believe that some intelligence outside of yourself puts it there. But that gets into the question of fate. Fate occupies both ends of the spectrum of freedom and control. If things are fated, you have no control. But with this lack of control comes a freedom from responsibility. Freedom was paramount to Blake. He was a pioneer of free love before the Romantics and before the hippies or the body art of the 1960s. He hated the idea that adultery was a sin. At the same time, he was firmly opposed to prostitution, a kind of love that isn't free since it costs money. I like Blake's idea of free love because I also don't like the idea of binding people. But at the same time, jealousy can imprison even the die-hard devotees of freedom, and the alternative is binding someone in a relationship with a certain exclusivity. Then, jealousy fights with faith, the investment you have in trusting that other person. Blake wrote a lot about jealousy and free love, but never gave us the solution to his conflicting characters of reason and freedom. To Blake, his made-up god, Urizen, sounds like your reason, represented the devil, but Goya said the sleep of reason produces monsters. Or in other words, imagination without the aid of reason, Urizen, produces hallucinations and eventually suffering. Actually, the beautiful thing about Goya's quote is that it's ambiguous. Is it your reason being asleep and therefore not functioning that causes the monsters? Or is reason like a kind of sleep which itself can create illusions? His point is that hell exists at both extremes, and so the two sides have to be balanced. Perhaps Goya's greatest demonstration of this pessimism about the two extremes of imagination and reason is in his Disasters of War series of prints. The war in question was the Peninsular War, from 1807 to 1814, when Napoleon invaded Spain. On the left, two Spanish guerrilla fighters face off against a group of French soldiers. To Goya, the invading French soldiers were emblems of reason taken to its furthest extent. 2 decades earlier, the revolution in France began the process of restructuring society according to the new wave of ideas called the Enlightenment, which espoused decisions made through reasoned thought. The French cut a lot of people's heads off in their pursuit of pure reason. Goya is commenting on the violence associated with total reason, but he does not only implicate the French soldiers. The title of the print is Con raison o sin ella, which means with or without reason. He's calling attention to the fact that the Spanish soldiers are not innocent here. They're fighting and killing too. His point is that whether you think of yourself as having reason or not, the result is the same: violence. So, that's Europe, constantly cutting itself up in the rest of the world in an effort to understand itself. But there are many parts of the world. Does the god of reason, Urizen, govern the rest of the world? Well, it's true we all have heads, so it would make sense. But perhaps there are other stories on this globe about how the world works, and Blake had other gods which represented other parts of the body. Maybe the head is a kind of meeting place where all the input from the body tries to communicate with itself. Some neuroscientists believe that there are many selves which take the reins at different times. There are psychoanalysts like Lacan who go further and question the exclusive interiority of our subject position altogether. We not only have many selves, but we are not limited to the interior sense of self we have come to understand. We are other people, or other people are aspects of us. Lacan wrote that the unconscious revealed itself not only in our dreams or in our thoughts, but out there, in the world which we think of as separate from ourselves. Subject. The eye was my eye. I remember being very young, maybe 6 years old, and holding my first sketchbook. I remember making a mark, a curving hook-like mark on the page, and the graphite seeming to sink into the paper. I knew then that drawing was a magical force, sinister maybe, but transformative. In painting class, I made a self-portrait. A professor said, "You've got the light, now you have to get the form." At a music festival, I took magic mushrooms and ventured into the enormous stage area with some friends. I remembered watching Andrew Bird and feeling as though I was about to die. One friend graciously walked me back to the tent. I went inside and saw police lights outside my tent. They have found me, and I am going to die. I closed my eyes and struggled for a moment. It seemed as though I had receded into a space where I no longer knew anything about the world. A voice, I thought maybe my own, listed in my head aspects of the world I knew. "Do you remember things?" asked the voice. I thought I couldn't take it anymore and that I didn't care what people thought of me for dying at the music festival. I left the tent. There were no police cars there. A young woman from another tent asked, "Are you Liam?" For a moment I thought I really had been the one to die at the music festival and that everyone knew my name because of it. Again I thought I didn't care. I replied, "Yes." She said, "How are you feeling?" And I knew that my friend had informed her of my bad trip. I felt a sense that they cared. I was in Italy in 2016. There they had said, "You know a lot, but you don't know anything." I was painting some of the Italian residents at a cafe. Dan Gustin, one of my teachers there, had asked, "Do you care what they think of you?" I made a painting a day when I returned from my senior year. I was failing at every painting I made, losing my mind, making a fool of myself painting outdoors on campus where everyone could see me, with paint all over my clothes. I evidently cared what other people thought of me. Nikki had told me, "You need to have something to hold on to." John told me to paint in the landscape and to respond in a gestural way. This was the holding on. The moment of looking at something, you grab hold of it with the paint on the surface of the canvas. But Brian was also telling me to let go. I remembered one time I really tried to let go. I let go of all sensation, and it was like the sensation was alive. I felt as though I had a presence in my stomach. I forcefully ejected a pink ghost from myself, who then sat sadly just beyond the edge of my wall. I remember reading Borges, and the words became unknown to me. As I was reading, it seemed that the words on the page were meaningless, and that the real story was happening in my internal monologue. I was confused and tried to stop reading. I looked at the next line. It read, "We push on." I put the book down and did not finish it. I was reading Mondrian. Mondrian said he couldn't even look at green or trees, so he put shutters on his windows when he lived in the countryside. Mondrian had a metaphor of a blind man in a hedge. I began to believe that I saw the hedge, a mass of foliage, confusing and complex. I'd have intonations of this feeling sometimes. It represented being blind, being lost in matter, without form, without coherence. This is the opposite of Mondrian's painting, which strived to create form out of matter. John had said, "You've got the light, now you have to get the form." Thursday nights they had life drawing at the college. I was 21, a senior in the fall of 2016. I brought my French easel and a limited palette of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and white to make a painting of the model. She was lying on a bed with her arm up, supporting her head. I began working on a small panel about 12 inches square. I drew out the scene in orange and began working into it with thick strokes of paint applied with a small brush. Earlier in the year, while coming down from an acid trip, I had had the notion that I was following a certain sensation, like a stylus or grinding implement following a rut that was carved into a large granite stone. It was leading me. I thought if I could close my eyes and follow it, it would lead me somewhere. In the moment of painting at the life drawing session, I thought I was following something. The sensation and my thoughts had become one. I didn't know what I was thinking about, but it felt out of my control. Not out of control, but that I was following it, obeying it, and it was making the painting. I made a mark right on the painting's left edge. The mark seemed to infer an eye. The eye was my eye, and the edge of the painting, the left side of my head. My left eye opened. Space flowed into my vision. I had no idea what to do. In my mind, I remembered only that I was making a painting of the model. I looked out at her. To my surprise, I saw only a shifting patchwork of shapes. And then I realized my heart was on fire. I had the feeling like skin rub raw. The experience was painful. Was there an explanation for this pain? What did my vision say about human beings? The model had turned into shapes, into geometry. Could this be the price of total freedom? Would I lose other people if I gained an eye without boundaries? Were other people even real? The vision faded. But when I looked at the painting, I could feel it starting all over again. It was the painting itself that was doing this to me. The painting was causing this experience in me. If other people were real and didn't see this world, I felt I could never show them the painting, effectively force them to see my vision. I made a mark right on the eye, and when I looked, I had destroyed it. Space no longer flowed into my eye. Immediately I regretted the decision, but the vision had been painful. Or had I just been afraid of it? Were the two the same? Or was the pain trying to tell me something? What if my vision hadn't been painful? Could I have been free of the limitations of my eye and also keep other people around? What does it mean to lose your subject? Was breaking free of subjectivity a transformation of humans into a secret, surreal world? And if this world exists, I saw it. Does it mean I can go back? Could I bring other people? Can I really have it all? Double click. In double click, there are words which are recognizable, although perhaps obscured. The words seem to be labeling the painting, which becomes like a kind of dissection table or an insect mounting board. The painting is the dissection of this chrysalis shape, which has the moth overlaid on it. But it's not just a dissection of the moth, it's a dissection of the story I created around the moth. I keep coming back to this story as I feel it represents me. It's my story. It's my mythology. When I was young, I created a fictional world as many children do. I drew a map and I populated this world, which I called Double Click. And yes, I know an internet advertising company shared the name, but I was a kid. I populated this world with drawings of fantastical monsters. Of course, all these creatures bore some relationship to the world I knew. One of them looked like a Luna moth, and so I called it LunaClick. The characters were beautiful to me, and I drew them with bright colors. But despite the childlike palette, most of the creatures I drew and the stories I wrote were not so benign. The violence of the world I thought to be separate from DoubleClick still made its way into my fantasy. The main story is frightening to me. It involves a murder and a subsequent revenge. But the act of vengeance does not fall on the murderer. Instead, it results in the death of the moth creature LunaClick. Recently, I've been making paintings of the map of DoubleClick. However, this time I superimposed the Luna moth over the map. It made sense. DoubleClick had always been LunaClick, and vice versa. The story was now clear to me. The act of destroying LunaClick, who existed in the world, had resulted in the destruction of the entire fantasy. Perhaps the horror of the revenge and the senseless violence against the creature of my creation brought me back to my life. DoubleClick fell apart when the violence reached a certain threshold, when its charm could not make up for real-world pain. Will the violence always find its way back into the paradise of our imagination? Could we create a beautiful world without stories of revenge? It brings us to the idea of building a better paradise, one where horror doesn't pass a certain threshold. Paradise. The painting used to have the word bikini written on the back. If you saw it a couple weeks ago, you would have been able to find it. It's supposed to be the location of the work. I was inspired by footage of the detonation of the nuclear weapon in the Pacific Ocean at Bikini Atoll. The film shows a group of palm trees disintegrating, blasting apart from the nuclear wind. The painting doesn't show the destruction of any real palm trees. It doesn't show the poisoning of the land and ocean around Bikini. It doesn't show the irradiation and deaths of indigenous residents allowed to return to the island. The painting simply represents the beauty of Bikini and the palm trees that gave the atoll its name. Bikini, in the language of the Marshall Islands, means surface of coconuts. Why did the United States blow up Bikini? Is it because it was an island paradise? Is it that we want to build a better paradise for ourselves? Do we believe in building a paradise anymore? Can we envision a paradise without eventually submitting it to nuclear wind? Do we require the rapture first to blow away God's creation? No. Simply put, America blew up Bikini because they wanted to test a nuclear weapon. In the culture of the West at the time, the success of the test represented a kind of liberation, the end of World War II. Soon after, Louis Réard, a French designer, popularized a new swimsuit called a bikini. By the end of the war, the nuclear test at Bikini Atoll had become associated with a new liberation of women's bodies on the beach. It's funny to me that we still refer to women's two-piece bathing suits as bikinis. Not really funny, kind of horrific actually. But then when is it too much? When does the absurdity, the horror, the shame of a destructive human event and the frivolously human response to it become simply too much? When is it too painful? In reaction, people try to turn it off, to cut the feelings, the body off, but it's not always so easy. The small paradises we give ourselves offer only temporary relief, like a vacation to a tropical island maybe. Real violence, when we cause it, is harder to ignore. It makes us afraid. We fear that we are not fully in control of ourselves. We may also fear others' retribution, making it difficult to move on. And sometimes we fear that there is absolutely nothing we can do to make things right. Bikini Atoll is gone and irradiated. Teaching statement. It is a question of teaching. Is the world out there bearable enough? Or is there an urgency for students to learn as much as possible in the short period during school, to go as far as possible? Perhaps everyone is different. When I was in undergraduate school, I pursued learning with a doggedness that often reflected the speed of the voices coming at me, and what I saw as the conflicting nature of these voices. It was difficult to put opposites together, and I often fell into confusion. Such is life, but at a certain threshold of confusion, when one begins to hurt oneself, one begins to think of Clement Greenberg's argument for limits in art. Many artists are constantly fighting against limits in art. I usually think I'm one of them. They use their imagination to try to break free of rules. But the truth is, we live in a twisted up world, and however far we go in our learning or our imagination, we will inevitably come back to the problem of real life. I can teach what I know. It is only my hope that I do not cross a certain threshold of confusion or terror in reminding a student that we exist in a very real and at times very frightening world. Perhaps there is an urgency in conveying this message, for their own good. But never to lose the simple spirit, the revolt against this sense of imposed duty. Nothing comes for free. Pain is the currency by which we gauge genuine or real or felt or true art. But again, the limitations must come in. I want a limit to pain, a distance from pain. My choice to cut it off when it gets to be too much. There must be a better way to learn, to teach. Or is that just my imagination? Acknowledgements. I would like to thank the people who have taught and supported me from my first attempts at making art through the process of writing and coming to terms with this lengthy artist's statement. I want to thank my father, who provided me with a writer's eye and helped edit my words, which can, as a painter, sometimes feel out of reach. Thanks also to my mother, a guiding light for drive and work ethic, and for helping me to keep straight everyday practicalities like health insurance, medication, and rent. I want to thank Charles Palermo, William and Mary art history teacher, for providing me with a loose framework of ideas concerning religion and economics, and allowing me to put the pieces together on my own. Thanks to Martha Armstrong and Dan Gustin, who lived with me in Italy. They taught me how two voices which seem contradictory can actually represent a unity. A big thanks to the painting professors I had during college who make an appearance in this thesis, Nicole Santiago, Nikki, who said that sometimes you need something stable in life, something to know, something to hold on to, Brian Cordados, who showed me that you also have to let it go to breathe, and John Lee, who told me that although there are certain things we have to let go of in life, we will always hold on to the people who meant the most to us. To the Boston University painting faculty, Mark Skeppens, Jaya Howie, Lucy Kim, Hugh O'Donnell, Richard Ryan, Mina Hassan, and Josephine Halverson, I don't know how to thank you enough. There is so much to say. I am still and will be learning from you for a long time after I leave school. To the other BU students, you remind me what I love about community. You make that happen for me. I don't know how to thank you either. Rather, I will leave this Leonard Cohen quote here at the end. It is for you. I am not looking for another as I wander in my time, walk me to the corner, our steps will always rhyme. You know my love goes with you as your love goes with me. It's just the way it changes like the shoreline and the sea. But let's not talk of love or chains or things we can't untie. Your, my, eyes are soft with sorrow. Hey, that's no way to say goodbye. It never ends. A friend of mine told me that graduate school was the time when students experience or go through the Lacanian death of the big other. For Lacan, the big other represents identity, a subject which possesses so many people, especially my generation, and generally speaking, in this time. The, quote, death of the big other for the surrealist Lacan did not signify an end, as we traditionally or existentially think about death, but rather a transformation. Transformation can result in a kind of progression, but can also too easily disguise a return, an eventual fallback into stasis. So, transformation is not a given, but rather a question. I want to bring up Moshe's painting in relation to this thesis. In the painting, there is a knight who is black, impaling a disturbing animal-like creature, which is white. There's a lot of pain in this work for me, but not just because I am ashamed and horrified by the idea that someone would have a fantasy about murdering something, which although it looks evil, I nevertheless identify with. I have to identify with it. There is a sense of responsibility which, at first glance, feels imposed externally. Perhaps some of that does come from Moshe, but it also comes from me. The world in Moshe's painting, which might operate in a very different way for him, nevertheless represents my fantasy. I think it represents the fantasy of a lot of people who can't help but identify with that white gremlin in his painting. You know, the fantasy that I will ever be free of my own whiteness. That's part of the pain I feel when I look at Moshe's painting. Moshe's pain might be different. I'm not going to dissect Moshe's pain. I know he doesn't want me to. I don't want to. But I want to touch on this idea of identity as something that is a priori, that is, something that comes before, something that is not only an issue in the present but also in our deep past. I want to acknowledge the prospect of changing something so deeply about our history, the history we share, the response to which establishes our identity ourselves, can often seem like a fantasy. But it's not a fantasy. It's real, and at the same time, it is a question. I can't force anyone to think about identity because it's painful, really painful. How do you teach someone about that? Identity is an enormous part of our lives. It is everywhere in our culture these days. But it's always the question of transformation. Like revolution, those painful transformations which took place in the past. This may be our only option. Maybe it's what we want. But when we talk about teaching, there can be a threshold to the violence. And then another question arises as these ideas become more and more relevant to our social concerns. Can you teach about identity in a more foundational setting? Maybe this would mean finding ways of allowing certain transformations which acknowledge pain and responsibility, but perhaps don't exceed a certain threshold of pain, of self-laceration. What I regret is that it took so long for me to get to this point. Of course, there's a sense of shame and a question of there still being a sense of distance. But I wonder what might have happened if I had gotten over myself, my identity, sooner. And I haven't gotten over it. There is more to learn. At the end of the day, I am responsible for my past, I am responsible for my present and future. It might be my responsibility to teach what I know, and I am learning about my own identity, my whiteness. I feel a certain responsibility to allow people like me, white people, and maybe more specifically young white men, to confront their own issues of identity, and maybe develop language or painting which could support their own transformation. I want that for me, to continue to answer the question of my own transformation, but I also want it for them. And of course, there are other people who experience a lot of pain daily which I have never experienced. I would have to learn a lot, perhaps live a lot more to know how to help or care for people outside of my experience, my identity. The question of accepting this transformation and learning from it, though it might be painful, never goes away. And there is a sense of responsibility, but it's always your decision. It's always my decision.